because here's the relationship in Ireland between mortality and temperature. A lot of people die in the winter from cold. We have one of the highest cold death rates in Europe, much higher than Scandinavia, because our houses tend to be not well insulated, and often, especially the elderly, suffer hypothermia during the cold winter spells. So if this curve shifts to the right by a few degrees, we lose a lot of this, so it will be beneficial. We may gain some extra mortality in heat wave conditions in the hot summers, but overall we can expect to see a reduction in mortality as temperatures rise. So it's not all bad news. Equally so, our tourism industry has an opportunity to adapt positively in the years ahead. I'm not saying that we shouldn't do things about climate change, but some things are going to happen inevitably. And one of them is that as our summers get warmer, it means that our shoulder season extends. This is the Tourist Comfort Index for Ireland. And you can see that by the middle of the century, you can see how the temperature in May is quite similar. The comfort index in May is quite similar to June today. So we have an extra month of the tourist season there, and something similar also in September. So there's opportunities there for the tourist industry in particular to extend its season. Very quickly moving on to the risks again, because they're very powerful instruments now to enable us to look at risks from inundation, from flooding, for example. And here's a little case study we did for Dublin. Here's Dublin Bay here. The heights are down to the nearest half metre or metre in some cases. And each of the green dots represents an address. And we can work out how many addresses therefore lie between 0 to 5, 5 to 1, 0.5 to 1, 1 to 2 metres, 2 to 3 metres, and so on, for each of our coastal counties. And when we do that, well, Louth, for example, you can see there are something like 5,000 addresses in County Louth, around 4 metres above sea level, just under 5,000, 3 metres above sea level. But if you take Dublin, you can see it's very different. You have about 15,000 addresses less than 3 metres above sea level. Now, if I tell you that the once-in-a-century high water level of the city on the east coast is about 2.6 metres, and that's before you think about sea level rise, you realise that there's a vulnerability there which has to be considered in the years ahead. Now, we can guess how much would that cost in terms of claims if those 15,000 houses in the city were flooded, or in the case of Cork, if the 10 or 11,000 houses less than 3 metres above sea level were flooded. We can work out from the relative costs of flood claims in 2009. Now, I'd love to be able to update this from last winter. It's going to be a much higher figure. But we can say, well, what if all those houses were flooded? Well, you can see how a 2 metre event quickly goes up to €1.5 billion of loss. A 3 metre event goes over 2 billion. If you take County Louth, for example, you can see the exposure is about 125 million in this county alone for a 2 metre event. So you can work out, is it beneficial to defend, is it not beneficial to defend? And it will only be beneficial to defend urban land. I hate to say, we have to start thinking seriously about a planned retreat in some cases from lands that are going to be not defensible on economic grounds. It costs 12 million for every kilometre of seawall. Where do you spend that 12 million? You don't spend it defending agricultural land which is worth 10,000 euros an acre, a hectare. So we have to be realistic about where we spend limited funds, and that's going to be a problematical thing to do because of our attachment to land in Ireland. Let's remember that the problems that we're seeing globally are not the problems caused by these countries with hardly any greenhouse gas emissions relative to some of the big boys up here in the Northern Hemisphere. And that's an issue of justice, it's an issue of ethics. It's an issue which says, just because we're okay, it doesn't mean to say we shouldn't try and encourage development in these areas on sustainable lines. We shouldn't try and make reparation for some of the problems that we're causing people who have no real act in causing the global temperature problem. And that brings us to the final issue of legislation, of controls. First point to make is that we in Ireland have one of the highest greenhouse gas emissions per capita in Europe, and indeed in the world. Because we have a large industrial sector and a large agricultural sector, we have a twin problem of greenhouse gas emissions. Other countries are beginning to do things in terms of target reductions, and some of them are achieving quite remarkable reductions even already as we speak. Even the much beloved Russia is targeting 15 to 25% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions over the next 8 or 9 years. We're in a situation today where we're contemplating a climate change bill which has no targets at all. And that's going to be the next round of the argument, because the government has set its views against having any targets in the climate change bill other than the ones that we're obliged to under our European commitments, but nothing in terms of a figure even for 2050, which is a long way away. And that's quite worrying, because at the moment we're seeing our greenhouse gas emissions going back up. In the middle of a recession, our greenhouse gas emissions shouldn't be increasing, and yet they are, coming primarily from energy. Coal has become cheap again, coming from the early stirrings of Harvest 2020, which I won't say anything else about today, coming from other things like industry and commerce. So going the wrong direction, really. And that's why it's so important, I think, to communicate this message properly, because there's a lot of misinformation around, and you should be really careful about who you believe, the rubbish you see on blogs, the rubbish you see in tabloid press. For atmospheric scientists, as I've said, you're looking at a debate which is finished, which maybe has 1% of publishing climatologists only, who are not convinced of the role of humans in current global climate change. But we've lost the debate over with the public as a result of a very sustained effort in misinformation. People will say global warming is over, it hasn't warmed since 1998. So be careful about people who cherry pick a trend line. You can pick a trend anywhere on this data and get what you want, but you have to look at the overall trend. So be careful you don't do what many skeptics do, and just cherry pick a trend which can show you what you want to see, rather than the really true long-term trend, which is what you have to be swayed by overall. So I think it's just important not to believe some of the stuff that's often put out by vested interest groups. Last couple of points then. Well, we know that international negotiations have not shown the promise in terms of reducing global emissions that people thought they would. Most recently in Warsaw, again, the progress was not made. And that progress is something that we have to get back on track, because once we get a 2-degree rise in our global temperature above pre-industrial levels, then we begin to see unknown events becoming more likely. We begin to have a lot more uncertainty in the models of what Greenland will do, of what Antarctica will do, of what the Gulf Stream will do after 2 degrees warming. And we're really not going to achieve that at the moment to any extent. Now, you might think it's a problem for the future, but in fact it's a problem very much for today, because the window of opportunity is closing very quickly. Had we started on the journey of reducing emissions a few years back, we could have had a luxury of a global reduction, maybe at the rate of 3 or 4% per year. Were we to start next year, we would have to decrease our reduction in emissions by about 5% per year. And if we stall until 2020, which at the moment is looking likely, well, it becomes a really difficult task indeed to envisage. So time is not on our side in this problem. The last, I suppose, effort that will be made next year in Paris in 2015. And to try and aid that, the Secretary General, Ban Ki-moon, is calling a summit of heads of state, of heads of government, in New York at the United Nations in September of this year as a way of galvanizing action in a make-or-break effort for COP21, Conference of the Parties 21, in December of next year. And that's the last chance in many respects. So, we're facing a situation where political leadership in these groups are very small. In the absence of all of that, the only alternative for all of us is to do what we can, and to do as much as we can individually. And that's why I wanted to finish by just congratulating all of you for your individual efforts in the DkIT Green Campus project, because you're doing your bit. Just keep doing your bit, and hopefully what you're doing will rub off on the rest of society sooner or later. Thanks very much. We've got classes, or do you want to ask me questions? All right. Anyone that has to go to a class, feel free, don't worry.
Or you can have tea and coffee.
Could I just point out one thing? Franklin's lost expedition, I think Queen Victoria sent out 2 follow-up expeditions to try and find it. The second one was led by a Dundalk man, Leopold McClintock from Johnson Street. Yeah.
Oh, fascinating.
Just to let you know that.
And did he find the remains?
He did actually, yeah. And he basically brought Arctic logistics to a new level. He reinvented sleds and the kind of gear they were wearing to get there, whereas others had failed. He wasn't close to the Danish, you know, in terms of the way that the British approached Arctic exploration and moved things on dramatically. There's a plaque to his name down in Johnson Street in Dundalk. And I've been trying for years to get a street named after him, but I haven't succeeded. But I think he is a Dundalk hero. It is, yeah. Can I just ask you one question now that I've earned my question, perhaps a number of information? When you look at the investment rush into oil and new exploration, and the calculation is that we can only burn 20% of known reserves if we're to avoid the kind of scenario you're talking about. The markets are betting against the deal. Political leadership on this is very weak indeed. There's every reason to be pessimistic, especially when you look at where the money, smart money is going.
Yeah, I didn't want to be too doom and gloom.
Well,
that's bad enough, I know, but
yeah.
Certainly there is a lot of pessimism around. One thing that's often thrown into the mix here, though, is what the Chinese are doing, and supposedly opening one new coal-fired power station every week. But what's often forgotten is that the current Chinese policy is actually resulting in more renewables being added to their energy capacity every week than fossil fuels being added to their energy capacity every week. So even those countries are beginning to waken up and beginning to move in the right direction. It'll take a long time. And of course, you're right. I mean, as tensions increase in the world, people will start looking for more reserves, energy security will become more important. We saw in Ireland recently, in the first, well, not recently, but the first National Climate Change Strategy, a proposal to convert money point to gas was shot down by the ESB because they wanted to retain energy security, supposedly. And there are many ways of having energy security without necessarily going down the fossil fuel burning route to a bigger extent than they are at the moment. But yeah, the dice it's not looking good. You're quite right. Especially with the energy security now in America, from fracking especially. And America is going to become more insular. It's not going to be too crucial about what happens in the rest of the world. So the pressure will come on other places, I think, in that situation.
Even in local government terms, the resistance here to the cycle network that we put in Dundalk has been, it says to me that people absolutely love their cars and consider the car as having particular rights, and it's very, very hard to disabuse people of that notion, especially when the cyclists take up scarce urban space. That's been, it's been a salutary lesson, and a lot of towns are now trying to, compete for funding for greenways and all that. It takes a certain political nerve to actually do it and hold on to it, because the opposition is visceral at times. And finally, could I wish you well on the Hinkley Point judgment in the courts tomorrow?
The idea, I was listening to the radio on the way up here, we were talking about this being 10th anniversary of the smoking ban,
Mm.
and they had Jackie Healy-Rae on, or one of the Healy-Rae, saying it'll never catch on. This thing couldn't possibly happen. And it tells me a little that, as a small country, when we get our act together, we can move quite quickly, and things that we don't think are conceivable can happen. And that's why I'd be more optimistic about your cycleways and about people's love affair with the car being maybe loosened over the coming years. And it's a hard thing. We're all emotionally attached to our cars, no doubt about it. But if we have the conditions created for us, and the encouragement of sensible planning practices, of sensible routeways, of sensible cycleways, I think the Western cycleway has been an eye-opener to people in terms of economics especially, then I'll be more hopeful.
Sorry, just a question. The World Wildlife Fund have done studies and they reckon that by 2050 we need 3 planets to support us continue to use the resources. And also there have been, Al Gore said at Davos that by the end of the century there'll only be enough resources if renewables keep going to support 2 billion people. So is it possible that really there's a, not that it hasn't actually been conceived, but you're thinking, well, all the people in the low-lying areas, those people in Bangladesh, those poor people, well, really we can dispose of those, let nature take its course and wipe those people out with disease and flood, and with the 2 billion of us, nice middle-class people, and our numbers are going to continue to increase, that we'd be all right, Jack. Do you think that there's an element of that?
Every country acts as an individual, looking after their own self-interest, and we've seen that so often through history. And I think that's what will happen. I mean, there's lifeboat ethics at work here as well. As long as we're okay, we won't let anybody else into our lifeboat. And I think there's an element of selfishness underpinning all of this as well. I think what you're describing there is the Malthusian doctrine, which kind of faded out of popularity a century ago and has now come back in again. The idea that people can outstrip the resources on which they depend rather more easily than we thought in the past. So that kind of scenario, it's a doomsday scenario. It's a doomsday scenario, but there will be elements of it which happen. I mean, one thing that could happen in Bangladesh is when you have 40 million refugees looking for somewhere to live, they can't find it in their own country, they start looking at other countries. In Darfur, for example, a lot of the conflict was over dwindling water supplies. And the Middle East is a tinderbox waiting to go up for the same kind of issue. So we will see political jostling, geopolitical action as countries seek to look after their own self-interest, and that is where things can unravel very quickly. We may not be okay up here. We may do better relatively than many other countries, but I don't think we'll be immune from the kind of problems that other countries have had. There will be opportunities for us, certainly to export food to many parts of southern Europe, which are going to become rather more badly affected than we can. But ethically, it makes no sense for us to start saying we're going to increase our greenhouse gas emissions to increase food security in the world.
Well, if we can't get the ethics right of our guards, having them probably won't be able to talk to them on the road.
Well, maybe the President's ethics campaign has something going for it in that respect. That's something we should support.
I suppose I just really wanted to say a big thank you to John for coming. And John taught me geography when I was in college. And I think you've been actually working bit by bit, as you said, about evidencing opinion and convincing people and creating, I suppose, being really understandable communication about what's going on. And I want to thank you for coming to DkIT and to Green Week today, but also to thank you for that big work, because it's really admirable and it's very encouraging and hopeful. So thank you very much.